The Soviet bomber that helped secure nuclear parity. 44 world records, and the title of the biggest or the most in several key categories at once. Among other things, the Tu-160 remains the heaviest combat aircraft and the heaviest supersonic aircraft in the world. It's also one of the largest and most powerful bombers in aviation history. For decades, the White Swan has remained in service, playing its part in Russia's nuclear triad. Near the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union created one of the most impressive aircraft ever built, the Tu-160, known in Russia as the White Swan and to NATO as the Blackjack. This was a supersonic missile-carrying bomber with variable sweep wings, designed to strengthen the airborne leg of the Soviet nuclear triad. Even today, the Tu-160 is regarded as the largest supersonic aircraft in military aviation and one of the heaviest combat aircraft in the world. During the Cold War, aircraft like this were symbols of second strike capability. Even if missiles and bases came under threat, a bomber could still be sent into the air, fly a long-range route, and launch cruise missiles from far outside the immediate danger zone. The Trinity of the Apocalypse. In August 1945, the world entered the atomic age. From that moment on, military power was no longer measured only in soldiers, tanks, and ships. It was also measured by the ability to deliver a single warhead to a strategic target. A little over 4 years later, the Soviet Union split history into before and after once again. A second country on the map now had a nuclear bomb of its own. And while it's hard to overstate the importance of either event, there is one important nuance to keep in mind. Militarily, the situation at that exact moment was not quite as apocalyptic as it is often made to sound in popular media. Yes, the Americans had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, but by 1946, despite all the loud talk about a hypothetical Third World War and nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union, the United States did not yet have a truly mature system for delivering atomic weapons. In other words, the problem was not just the bomb itself, it was the entire chain of use. The warhead had to be assembled, prepared, transported to an airfield, loaded onto an aircraft, and then flown thousands of miles to the target. At least the United States did not have delivery systems in sufficient numbers for a war against a country that had just emerged victorious from the most brutal land and air war in history. At that point, the US had only a handful of bombers suitable for delivering nuclear weapons to their targets. So America's early nuclear superiority looked impressive politically, but militarily, it had not yet become the kind of global, instant strike system that nuclear forces would later evolve into. In fact, the delivery problem remained one of the central issues until the late 1950s, when missile technology made a major leap forward. And once again, it happened in August, this time in 1957. The Soviet Union tested the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7. This represented an entirely different level of threat. It was no longer a bomber that had to break through air defenses. It was a missile capable of carrying a warhead across intercontinental distances. In 1958, similar tests began in the United States, but Rome was not built in a day. Even with the arrival of ICBMs, the theory of nuclear delivery was still far from simple. Alongside bombs and missiles, the doctrine of how to use them was also evolving. By the early 1960s, the concept of nuclear triad had taken shape, a 3-part structure for basing nuclear weapons on land, at sea, and in the air. Land-based missiles would sit in silos or on mobile launchers. Sea-based weapons would be carried by submarines, and the airborne leg would consist of strategic bombers and missile-carrying aircraft. The idea behind the triad was simple: never put all your eggs in one basket. Missile silos could be targeted in a first strike, bombers could be intercepted, submarines could be hunted, but when nuclear weapons are spread across land, sea, and air, completely disarming an opponent becomes almost impossible. Only this kind of structure could guarantee an inevitable and devastating retaliatory strike in the event of war. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Even if the enemy strikes first, you still have something left to strike back with. And that means a first strike stops being a victory and becomes suicide. In that sense, the only winner in a nuclear war would be a country that never took part in it. Good intentions, complicated results. Of course, the nuclear triad did not settle into place overnight. Up until the 1970s, both sides of the Cold War had their own imbalances in this area. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union became deeply invested in what could be called missile optimism, openly neglecting entire families of weapons in the belief that missiles were the future. The Americans, meanwhile, despite the rapid development of missile technology, chose a more familiar path. They focused heavily on building new strategic bombers. In fact, the first White Swan, in a sense, belonged to the other side. By the late 1960s, the backbone of American strategic aviation was still the B-52, an aircraft developed in the 1950s. And by the way, the B-52 is still in service today. But the B-52 was a subsonic aircraft. The Pentagon, however, was already dreaming of a supersonic counterpart, the American Valkyrie. Back in 1954, the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command issued a requirement for a supersonic high-altitude bomber. That requirement eventually grew into the XB-70 Valkyrie. 10 years after the requirement was issued, the aircraft made its first flight. But by 1969, the project was shut down. Still, the idea itself did not disappear. In 1970, work began on a new aircraft. The project survived several near-death experiences, but with help from Ronald Reagan, the new bomber finally saw the light of day. That aircraft was the supersonic B-1 Lancer. So what about the Soviet Union, the American B-1 Lancer? Meanwhile, Soviet planners had finally come around to the fact that their strategic bomber fleet, built mainly around the M4 and the Tu-95, could no longer reliably penetrate modern air defenses. By then, it was already the second half of the 1960s. In the United States, work on the Valkyrie had been in full swing, and that meant one thing: sooner or later, a new class of aircraft capable of breaking through air defenses at supersonic speed was going to appear. So something had to be done. And that something began in 1967, when the Soviet Council of Ministers issued a decree calling for the creation of a new strategic bomber. The Swan spreads its wings. The Soviet Tu-135. If there was one thing the Soviet Union truly knew how to do, it was catching up quickly when it had to. And in the field of supersonic bombers with variable sweep wings, it managed to close the gap with the United States in a relatively short time. By 1975, a preliminary design for the new aircraft had already appeared. Of course, the work did not begin from nothing. The Soviet Union did have some experience to draw on. During the creation of the Tu-160, engineers naturally looked closely at the Tu-144 passenger aircraft. The long-shelved Tu-135 project also proved useful, an unrealized bomber concept that had been worked on as early as the 1950s. Still on guard, the Tu-160 made its first flight in 1981. And yes, its resemblance to the Lancer is largely superficial. Visually, the two aircraft do look similar. Both are supersonic. Both have variable sweep wings. And both were created for strategic aviation missions. But the White Swan was not simply a copy of the B-1. The Tu-160 included plenty of original solutions, from its layout and power plant to the way it was designed to operate as a missile carrier. A different bomber project proposed by the Myasishchev Design Bureau came much closer to directly following the American concept, but that project was abandoned for good back in the 1970s. In the end, it was the Tu-160 that became the Soviet Union's main supersonic strategic missile carrier. The aircraft entered service in 1987, at the very end of the Cold War. But the story of the White Swan did not end there. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, the division of the Soviet aviation inheritance, the cutbacks of the 1990s, and the return of long-range aviation to the center of strategic military planning. Today, the Tu-160 is more than a rare monument to an engineering era. It remains an active element of nuclear deterrence, the airborne leg of the very same triad for which the superpowers spent decades building aircraft, missiles, and submarines.